in the vast, silent expanse of the Canadian wilderness, where the winters are long and the isolation is absolute. The story began to take shape in the late 1970s that would eventually challenge our understanding of human belief. It is a story that exists in the shadow of the deep forest, away from the laws of civilization and the eyes of the public. This is not merely a tale of crime. It is a psychological descent into a world where reality was rewritten by one man. A world where pain became love, and where a group of intelligent, searching adults surrendered their freedom to build a kingdom for a self-proclaimed prophet. To understand the nightmare of the anthill kids, we must first peel back the layers of the man who built the hill. We must look into the mind of Roch Thériault. Born in 1947 in a small village in Quebec, Roch was a child of profound contradictions. From a young age, he was noted for his sharp intelligence and a voracious appetite for knowledge. He was not the monster under the bed. He was the charming boy next door who could quote scripture and debate philosophy. But beneath this veneer of brilliance lay a fractured psyche. He dropped out of school before completing his formal education, yet he never stopped learning. He became an autodidact, obsessed with two subjects that would become the pillars of his control: religion and medicine. He devoured medical textbooks with the same fervor he applied to the Bible, synthesizing a worldview where he was the ultimate authority on both the soul and the body. He grew up in a strict Catholic environment, but he viewed the traditional church as weak and corrupt. He believed he had a direct line to the divine, a secret knowledge that set him apart from the rest of humanity. By the time he reached his 30s, Roch had honed his ability to manipulate. He was charismatic, articulate, and possessed a magnetic intensity that drew people in. He didn't start his movement in a dark alley. He started it in the living rooms of people who were looking for answers. He targeted members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, not because he believed in their doctrine, but because he knew they were already attuned to the idea of the end times. Roch played on this fear with the skill of a maestro. He told them that the apocalypse was imminent, that the world was spiraling into a chaos from which there was no return. He spoke to their anxieties about modern society, their fears for their souls, and their desire for a pure, righteous life. He offered them a solution that was as seductive as it was dangerous. Follow him and be saved. He called himself Moses, the shepherd who would lead his flock away from the impending doom. His message was radical. He told his prospective followers that to truly serve God, they had to sever the chains that bound them to the sinful world. This meant selling their homes, quitting their jobs, and, most painfully, cutting all ties with family members who did not believe. It was a test of faith, he said, but in reality, it was the first step in a carefully calculated process of isolation. By burning their bridges, he ensured that once they crossed over into his world, there would be no way back. They gave him their money, their loyalty, and their futures. In return, he promised them a utopia. The group, consisting of about a dozen adults, moved first to a remote area in Quebec, christening their settlement the Eternal Mountain. In those early days, the deception was absolute. Life in the commune felt like a return to a simpler, holier time. They built their cabins by hand, feeling the satisfaction of honest labor. They farmed the land, broke bread together, and gathered around Roch in the evenings to hear him preach. He was a father figure, a protector, and a spiritual guide. The followers felt a sense of purpose they had never known in their previous lives. They believed they were the chosen few, the elect who would inherit the earth after the fire. They did not see the walls closing in. They only saw the light of their leader. But a utopia built on the ego of a narcissist cannot hold. The shift from benevolent leader to tyrant was subtle, a slow turning of the screw that the followers barely noticed until it was too late. Roch began to implement a series of controls designed to break down their individual wills. It started with the schedule. He claimed that sleep was a luxury of the weak, a time when the devil could infiltrate the unguarded mind. He began to wake the group at all hours of the night for emergency drills, forcing them to run through the freezing woods in total darkness to prepare for the end of the world. The physical exhaustion was debilitating. A tired mind is a compliant mind. It cannot analyze. It cannot question. It simply obeys in order to rest. Then came the dietary restrictions. Roch began to dictate exactly what they could eat, framing it as a spiritual purification. He would put the group on strict fasts, sometimes allowing them only boiled wheat or molasses for days on end. They grew thin and weak, their bodies deprived of essential nutrients. Meanwhile, Roch ate heartily. He would feast on steaks and rich foods in front of them, explaining that, as the prophet, he bore a heavier spiritual burden and required the energy to protect them. It was a grotesque display of power, but his followers accepted it. They had been conditioned to see his gluttony as a sacrifice and their starvation as a privilege. The isolation deepened. Roch forbade them from listening to the radio or reading newspapers. He told them that the outside world was effectively dead, overrun by sin and demons. He became their only source of information, their only reality. If he said the sky was green, it was green. If he said they were sick, they were sick. And this is where the most terrifying aspect of his control began to emerge. Roch's obsession with medicine transformed from a hobby into a dangerous delusion. He announced to the group that he had been gifted with divine medical insight, that he could see illness inside them that no doctor could detect. The communal kitchen table was cleared. It was covered with a sheet and transformed into an operating theater. At first, the procedures were minor lancing a boil, stitching a small cut. But Roch was testing them. He was seeing how much pain they would endure, how much trust they would place in his hands. He used no anesthesia, claiming that pain was a necessary part of the healing process, a way to burn out the sin that had caused the sickness. He used common household tools, knives, needles, scissors that were far from sterile. As the first winter storms buried the eternal mountain in snow, the followers gathered around that table, watching their leader cut into their flesh, believing that the blood on his hands was the blood of a savior. They did not know that these minor surgeries were just the rehearsal for the atrocities to come. The mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It was a laboratory, and they were the experiments. By the time the group packed up their belongings to leave Quebec, the psychological walls around them were already high. but the physical move to Burnt River, Ontario, would seal their fate. This relocation was not a fresh start. It was a strategic retreat into deeper darkness. Roch Thériault, paranoid that the authorities or curious neighbors in Quebec were getting too close to his eternal mountains, sought a place where his authority would be absolute and unchallenged. They found it in a remote, densely wooded property that felt like the edge of the world. Here, the isolation was total. The trees were thick, the nearest town was miles away, and the winters were unforgiving. It was here that Roch gave his followers the name that would come to define their tragedy, the Anthill Kids. The name was not a term of endearment, it was a manifesto. Roch gathered his followers, men and women who had once been independent thinkers, and explained their new reality. He told them that an ant has no ego. An ant does not think of itself. An ant does not have personal desires, ambitions, or secrets. An ant lives, works, suffers, and dies solely for the good of the colony. And in this colony, there was only one queen, only one mind that mattered, Roch himself. He demanded that they strip away the last remnants of their individuality. They were to become a single organism, moving at his command, breathing at his will. To achieve this level of total submission, Roch knew he had to destroy the one thing that still competed with his authority, the family. He understood that a man who loved his wife, or a mother who prioritized her child, had a loyalty that was not directed at him. This was a threat. In a moment of calculated cruelty, Roch announced a new divine revelation. He declared that the institution of marriage was a corrupt, worldly invention, a symptom of the sin of possessiveness. He preached that in the eyes of God, jealousy was a poison. Therefore, he decreed that all existing marriages within the commune were null and void. The impact of this decree was devastating. Couples who had joined the group together, who had leaned on each other for support, were forcibly separated. But Roch's plan went darker. He announced that while his followers were forbidden from claiming partners, he, as the prophet, had a divine right to the women of the group. He claimed that it was his holy duty to father the next generation of perfect children, untainted by the sins of the fathers. He effectively seized the wives of his followers, turning the commune into his personal harem, under the guise of religious necessity. The humiliation for the men was absolute. They were forced to move into a communal dormitory, stripped of their roles as husbands and fathers. They had to watch as the women they loved were summoned to Roch's private quarters. They had to work in the fields to support children that Roch was fathering with their partners. To object was to question God. To show jealousy was to admit spiritual failure. Roch had engineered a scenario where the men were so broken by shame and emasculation that they could not fight back, and the women were so controlled by the narrative of holy duty that they could not refuse. He had placed himself at the center of every relationship, ensuring that no love existed in the anthill that did not pass through him. Life in the commune settled into a grueling, terrifying rhythm. To the outside world, however, the Anthill Kids wore a mask of normalcy. To fund their existence, Roch sent his followers out into the neighboring towns to sell homemade baked goods door to door. They became a familiar sight: women in long, modest dresses, and men in work clothes, smiling politely, holding out loaves of bread and bags of cookies. The locals saw them as a quirky, harmless religious sect, perhaps a bit eccentric, but peaceful. They had no idea that the eyes smiling back at them were deadened by trauma. They had no idea that beneath the heavy woolen coats, these bakers bore fresh scars, bruises, and burns. The money the townspeople handed over didn't go to charity. It went to Roch, who used it to buy alcohol, ammunition, and the tools he would use to torture them. Back at the camp, the mask came off. Roch ruled with a level of violence that was unpredictable and extreme. He instituted a system of discipline that turned the cabin into a dungeon. He would sit on a makeshift throne in the main room, often drinking heavily, and hold court. The infractions were trivial: a log dropped while building a fence, a meal that wasn't salty enough, a child crying too loudly. But the punishments were medieval. Roch, the self-proclaimed healer, became an artist of pain. He would use a sledgehammer to smash a follower's toe for walking too slowly. He would use pliers to extract a healthy tooth because a lie had passed through those lips. He would force members to sit on a hot stove or stand outside in the freezing Canadian winter without coats for hours. The violence was designed to shock, to overwhelm the nervous system so completely that the victim went into a state of dissociation. But the physical torture was only half of the equation. The true genius of Roch's control lay in what happened after the violence. Once the punishment was over, Roch would not cast the victim aside. He would pull them close. He would cradle them, tend to their wounds with a gentle touch, and weep. He would tell them how much he loved them. He would say, "Look what you made me do. I have to hurt you to save your soul because I love you more than anyone else does." This was the trap. This was the trauma bond. The victims, in their pain and confusion, didn't hate him. They felt guilty. They believed that they were the ones who had failed. They believed that his violence was the ultimate form of love, a father disciplining a wayward child. They would thank him for the punishment. They would apologize for making him hurt them. Roch had created a closed loop of abuse where he was both the monster and the savior. The children born into this environment knew no other reality. They were raised to fear the outside world as a place of fire and demons. They were taught that the police were agents of Satan who would kill them if they ever tried to leave. They called Roch Father, and they learned early on that his love was conditional and his rage was lethal. The anthill had become a self-contained universe of fear, sealed off by the forest. The followers were exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically shattered. They were trapped in a frozen hell, believing that the only thing keeping them safe from the apocalypse was the very man who was destroying them. And as the years dragged on, Roch's delusions would shift from discipline to something even more horrific. The doctor was about to begin his most ambitious work. By the mid-1980s, the anthill had ceased to be a religious commune in any recognizable sense. It had devolved into a macabre theater where the boundary between life and death was dictated entirely by Roch Thériault's whims. His guard complex had fully merged with his medical obsession, creating a terrifying new reality for his followers. The main cabin, filled with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and fear, became a grim parody of a hospital. Roch had acquired a library of medical books, but he lacked the fundamental understanding of biology, hygiene, or ethics. He believed that his spiritual sight allowed him to see inside the human body, to diagnose illnesses that science couldn't explain, and to cure them with methods that were nothing short of butchery. Roch's followers, conditioned to view him as infallible, brought their physical ailments to him instead of seeking real medical help. This trust led to tragedies that defy comprehension. The first major casualty of Roch's delusion was Solange, one of his most devoted wives. When she began to complain of severe, persistent abdominal pain, a rational response would have been a trip to the emergency room. A licensed physician likely would have diagnosed a treatable condition, perhaps an intestinal blockage or a hernia. But in the anthill, hospitals were forbidden. Roch declared that he knew exactly what was wrong. Her insides were knotted, he claimed, and he alone could untangle them. The scene that followed was a massacre masquerading as a miracle. Roch cleared the communal kitchen table and laid Solange down. There was no anesthesia available. He relied on alcohol to dull her senses, or simply commanded her to use her faith to transcend the pain. Using nothing more than kitchen knives and razor blades, he cut her open. For hours, he rummaged through her internal organs with his bare, unwashed hands, looking for a problem that existed only in his mind. In a moment of supreme madness, he poured olive oil into her open cavity, claiming it was an ancient, holy disinfectant. He even attempted to use a household vacuum cleaner to remove fluids from her body. Solange, fully conscious for parts of this ordeal, lay in agony, looking up at the man she worshipped as he slowly killed her. When she finally succumbed to the massive trauma and infection, Roch did not panic. He did not show remorse. He stood over her lifeless body and told the grieving group that Solange had died not because of his incompetence, but because her faith was weak. He claimed she had given up, that she lacked the spiritual will to live. He turned her murder into a lesson on obedience. They buried her in a shallow grave in the woods, unmarked and unmourned, terrified that they too might lack the faith to survive Roch's medicine. The cruelty did not spare the innocent. The children of the anthill were raised in this atmosphere of terror, viewing Roch as a deity who could give life and take it away. They were disciplined with the same brutality as the adults, but their small bodies were far less resilient. One of the darkest chapters in the commune's history involved a toddler named Samuel. The 2-year-old boy was sickly, often crying, likely due to a minor ailment or simply the stress of the environment. Roch, annoyed by the child's weakness and eager to test a new theory, decided the boy needed surgery. He claimed the child had a blockage in his groin area. Roch prepared the table once more. To sedate the toddler, he forced him to drink a lethal amount of alcohol. Then, using rough carpentry tools, he performed a butchery on the child's most delicate area. It was a senseless, barbaric act of violence. The child, poisoned by the alcohol and in shock from the trauma, died shortly after. Roch's reaction was chillingly pragmatic. He took the small body, the son of one of his followers, and burned it. He scattered the ashes to the wind, effectively erasing the child's existence. He told the mother that the boy was now an angel, that his death was God's will, and that grieving would be an insult to the divine plan. The mother, shattered and controlled, swallowed her screams and continued to work, terrified that she would be next. The atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. Every member knew that at any moment they could be called to the table. One woman, Gabrielle, became the focal point for Roch's sadism. Gabrielle was a strong, intelligent woman, which perhaps made Roch feel the need to break her more completely than the others. When she developed a minor infection in her hand, result of the filthy living conditions, Roch declared that the rot was spreading to her soul. He told her the hand had to be removed. He took her to the shed, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and stale air. He didn't use a surgical saw. He used a tool from his workbench. The cruelty was specific and calculated. He forced Gabrielle to help him. He made her hold the instruments, made her participate in her own mutilation. He convinced her that this was strength, that she was cutting away the sin. When the stump inevitably failed to heal because of the lack of antibiotics and hygiene, Roch escalated the torture. He claimed the toxins were hiding in her teeth. He used pliers to rip them out one by one. He claimed the infection was in her legs. He used a blowtorch to burn her skin, claiming he was cauterizing the pathways of the disease. Gabrielle was being dismantled, piece by piece, day by day. She was a living experiment for a madman who reveled in the power he held over her flesh. But in the depths of that agony, something shifted. As the physical pain became unbearable, the psychological fog began to lift. She looked at her broken body, at the stump where her hand used to be, and realized that this was not love. This was not God. This was death. She knew that if she stayed, she would end up in a hole in the woods like Solange. And in that clarity of impending death, Gabrielle made a choice. She would not die for him. She would try one last time to live. By 1989, Gabrielle was a ghost haunting the edges of the anthill, missing an arm, toothless, emaciated, and covered in burns. She was a walking testament to Roch Thériault's brutality. But in the depths of her physical ruin, a spark of survival had finally ignited. She realized that she could not outrun the commune. She was too weak, and the forest was too deep. If she wanted to live, she would have to outwit the man who claimed to know her every thought. She formulated a desperate gambit, a lie born of necessity. She approached Roch not with defiance, but with total submission. She told him that she wanted to continue serving him, but her body was failing. She begged him to let her go to a real hospital, not to escape, but to get strong enough to work for him again. It was a risky move. Roch could have killed her on the spot for suggesting it, but his narcissism was his blind spot. He was so convinced of his divine control, so certain that he had broken her spirit completely, that he believed her. He believed that she was incapable of betraying him, in a decision that would seal his fate. He drove her part of the way to the nearest town and watched her limp toward civilization, confident she would return like a faithful dog. When Gabrielle walked into the emergency room of the local hospital, the reaction was immediate silence. The nurses and doctors froze. They had seen car crash victims, industrial accidents, and the ravages of disease, but they had never seen a human being systematically dismantled like this. She looked like a survivor of a medieval dungeon. At first, she stuck to the script Roch had drilled into her, mumbling about an accident. But as the staff tended to her, cleaning her wounds with gentle, sterile hands, speaking to her with kindness instead of rage, the spell began to crack. The contrast between the hell of the anthill and the humanity of the hospital was too great. She looked into the eyes of a doctor and whispered the truth. She told them about Moses. She told them about the surgeries. She told them about the babies in the woods. The police response was swift and overwhelming. A tactical team descended on the Burnt River compound, expecting a heavily armed standoff. Instead, they found a scene of pathetic misery. They found the other members, gaunt and terrified, living in squalor. They found the kitchen table, stained with the dark fluids of years of torture. They found the rusty tools, the pliers, and the swords. And they found Roch. Even as they slapped the handcuffs on him, he didn't fight. He smiled. It was a chilling, arrogant smirk. He looked at the officers with pity, as if they were the ones who were lost. He truly believed he was untouchable. The trial that followed was a spectacle of the grotesque. Roch dismissed his legal team and chose to represent himself. He turned the courtroom into his personal stage, wearing his robes and lecturing the judge on theology. He cross-examined his own victims, forcing them to stand before him and relive their trauma. He bragged about his medical prowess, claiming the doctors simply didn't understand his advanced holistic techniques. He showed zero remorse for Solange, for Samuel, or for Gabrielle. To him, they were not victims. They were ungrateful subjects who had failed his test. But the jury saw the truth. They saw the scars, the missing limbs, and the shattered lives. Roch Thériault was found guilty of murder and assault and was sentenced to life in prison. But the horror didn't end with the slamming of a cell door. The survivors emerged from the forest into a world they no longer understood. They had to learn how to make decisions again. They had to learn that they were allowed to say no. They had to learn that love did not mean pain. The children, who had never known a life outside the commune, had to be integrated into a society they had been taught was evil. It was a slow, agonizing process of deprogramming, haunted by the nightmares of the cabin. Roch, meanwhile, remained a predator. In prison, he continued to manipulate. He charmed guards. He ran small cons, and in a shocking display of the system's failure, he even managed to father more children during conjugal visits. He never dropped the mask of the prophet. He remained convinced of his own divinity until the very end. But prison is a violent ecosystem with its own hierarchy. And a man who brags about hurting women and children does not sit at the top. In February 2011, the violence Roch had dispensed so freely finally came back to him. He was found dead in his cell at the Dorchester Penitentiary. He had been murdered by a fellow inmate, a man who had grown tired of Roch's arrogance. The scene was bloody and brutal. The man who had lived by the knife died by the knife, his throat slashed in a final, quiet act of retribution. There was no resurrection, no divine intervention. just a cold body on a concrete floor. The cabin at Burnt River is gone now, reclaimed by the earth. The trees have grown back, covering the paths where the ants once marched in silence. The snow falls and melts, washing away the physical traces of the camp. But some stains cannot be washed away. The story of the Anthill Kids remains one of the darkest chapters in true crime history, a terrifying reminder of the fragility of the human mind. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. True monsters don't look like monsters. They don't have claws or fangs. They have smiles. They have charisma. They offer us answers when we are lost, and they invite us into the warmth. The horror of the Anthill is not that it happened in a dark forest, but that it happened to people just like us. It serves as a permanent warning that the most dangerous cages are not made of iron bars, but of belief. And while Roch Thériault is dead, the silence of that forest still holds the echoes of the screams, a lingering testament to the darkness that lies in the heart of man. The snow covers everything eventually, but it can never hide the truth of what happened on the Eternal Mountain.